Before we begin, I want to ask, where are you watching from today? The Appalachian Mountains have many faces, and the story I'm about to tell you changes depending on which hollow or ridge you call home. If you're from these parts, you might have heard whispers. If you're not, well, consider yourself lucky. Some stories from these mountains aren't meant to travel beyond our hollers and ridges. This is one such tale, a story that's been deliberately erased from official records but continues to echo through time, carried forward through generations of whispered warnings. This is the story of the Adair brothers and what happened to them in the bitter winter of 1871. A tragedy so disturbing that local authorities, church leaders, and even family members worked methodically to scrub it from county records and community memory. What you're about to hear has been painstakingly pieced together from scattered journal entries found in forgotten attics, newspaper clippings preserved between Bible pages, and the reluctant testimonies of descendants who would rather forget their connection to this name. It's a story of identity, betrayal, and the terrible consequences of secrets kept too long. The Adair family lived in Cutter's Gap, a remote settlement nestled in the eastern portion of Kentucky's Appalachian region. The settlement was named after Jeremiah Cutter, who established a small mining operation there in the 1830s after discovering a modest coal seam that promised prosperity. The mine drew about 60 families to the area initially, creating a close-knit community bound by the isolation of mountain life and the shared hardships of extracting coal from the resistant earth. By 1871, the mine had been abandoned after a collapse that claimed 7 lives, but around 40 families remained, scratching out a living from the unforgiving mountain soil and whatever small game they could hunt in the surrounding forests. The Adair homestead sat a mile and a half from the nearest neighbor, up a narrow path that became impassable during heavy snow. The 2-story timber house had been built by the boy's grandfather, Silas Adair, who had acquired the land through means that were never quite clear to the community. Some said he won it in a card game from a Cherokee man passing through. Others suggested he took it from a man who mysteriously disappeared thereafter. The more charitable version claimed he purchased it legitimately from a family heading west after losing 2 children to scarlet fever. Whatever the truth, the land had passed to his son Jacob and then to the brothers after their parents' deaths. The house itself stood as a testament to the Adair family's peculiar position in the community. Neither poor nor wealthy, neither fully accepted nor explicitly rejected. Its foundation was laid with river stones hauled from Blackwater Creek, its walls built from oak and pine, harvested from the surrounding forest. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering views of the sloping meadow that gave way to dense woods on all sides. From certain angles, particularly at dusk, the house seemed to lean slightly, as if listening for something in the distance. Brothers Elijah and Thomas Adair were known in Cutter's Gap, but not particularly well liked. Elijah, the elder at 32, managed their modest family farm with ruthless efficiency. Every transaction was recorded in a leather-bound ledger he carried in his coat pocket. Every debt was collected, every favor remembered, and eventually called in. His face rarely betrayed emotion, not anger, not joy, not grief. Even at their parents' funerals, he had stood stoic, his eyes fixed on middle distance, while Thomas wept openly beside him. Thomas, 27, was quieter, more introspective, often spotted wandering the hills alone with his journal. Where Elijah was all sharp angles and calculated movements, Thomas had a softer presence. He would nod to neighbors in passing, occasionally help with community barn raisings, and sometimes traded his skilled woodworking for goods the brothers needed. His hands were always in motion, carving a piece of wood, mending a tool, or writing in his journal with a peculiar intensity, as if afraid the thoughts might escape before he could capture them on paper. Their father had died from a mining accident 10 years prior. His body recovered, but so mangled that the funeral was held with a closed casket, unusual for the time and place. Their mother succumbed to a winter fever shortly after, though rumors suggested she had simply lost the will to live after Jacob's death. The brothers had lived alone in the family home ever since, maintaining the property and a cautious distance from the rest of Cutter's Gap. What made the brothers notorious wasn't just their reclusiveness, but the way they would sometimes appear in town together, wearing identical clothes, moving with the same gait, finishing each other's sentences in a way that made the local children cross to the other side of the dirt road. Their strange synchronicity was unnerving, especially in a community already prone to superstition. Mothers would whisper to their children, "Don't stare at the Adair boys too long," though none could articulate exactly what they feared might happen if this rule was broken. But there was one detail about the Adair brothers that people couldn't quite reconcile, a detail that will become important as our story unfolds. Despite being brothers raised in the same household, one had deep blue eyes, while the others were brown. A small inconsistency, perhaps, but in isolated communities like Cutter's Gap, such differences sparked whispers. Some attributed it to their mother's supposed indiscretion with a traveling peddler years before Thomas's birth. Others suggested more fantastical explanations, that one brother had been touched by something in the woods, or that the blue-eyed one had been switched at birth with a changeling. Such superstitions might seem quaint now, but in the isolated hollows of 1870s Appalachia, they carried the weight of possible truth. On January 17, 1871, a Tuesday, both brothers were seen purchasing supplies at Wilson's General Store. According to Meredith Wilson's journal, recovered in 1923 during a church renovation, Elijah bought ammunition, salt, flour, and kerosene, while Thomas stood silently by the door, watching the street outside. Meredith noted that Thomas appeared uncharacteristically agitated, repeatedly checking the path leading back toward their property, as if expecting someone to follow them into town. When Elijah completed his transaction, Thomas hurried him along, whispering something that made the elder brother's face darken momentarily before he regained his usual impassive expression. As they left, Meredith observed Thomas place a folded piece of paper into the hands of young Sarah Jenkins, the blacksmith's daughter. The girl appeared confused but nodded before slipping the note into her apron pocket. What this note contained and whether it was ever read remains unknown. Sarah Jenkins and her entire family left Cutter's Gap the following spring, relocating to Ohio without explanation. Nothing about the brothers' behavior that day suggested the full horror of what would unfold in the coming days. But looking back, those who witnessed their final appearance in town would later recall a tension between them, an unspoken current of fear or anticipation that seemed to vibrate in the space between their bodies as they walked back up the mountain path, the snow beginning to fall in thick, silent flakes around them. The last person to see either brother alive was Samuel Tate, a trapper who passed by their property while checking his lines on January 18th. He would later tell the county sheriff that he saw smoke rising from the chimney and both men carrying what looked like heavy bundles into the barn. When asked if he spoke with them, Tate said he had waved but received no acknowledgement in return. "They was moving like men with purpose," he recalled, "didn't even look up when I called out. And there was something else. The door to their root cellar was standing open, despite the snow. Never known a mountain man to leave a cellar door open in winter, wasn't natural. And that's where our story truly begins, not with the brothers themselves, but with what happened after they seemingly vanished from the face of the earth, and the terrible discovery that would haunt Cutter's Gap for generations, a discovery that local authorities would attempt to erase from history, but which has persisted in family stories and nightmares for over a century and a half. Life in Cutter's Gap followed the rhythm of the seasons with a precision that modern people might find difficult to comprehend. Summer meant back-breaking labor, tending crops, repairing damage from spring floods, preparing for the harvest. Fall was for gathering, preserving, smoking meat, and the desperate race to secure enough sustenance for the coming cold. Winter meant survival, plain and simple. Families lived off preserved food, what little they could hunt in the snow, and the supplies they'd managed to purchase before the mountain passes became treacherous. It was a time of waiting, of stories told around fires, of watching the woodpile shrink and praying it would last until spring. For the Adair brothers, winter had always been a time of peculiar rituals. According to Martha Camden, whose grandmother had briefly worked as a housekeeper for the Adair family before the brothers' father died, they would spend the darkest days of winter engaged in what she called the accounting. "My grandmother said they would spread papers all over the dining table," Martha recalled in a 1935 interview for a never-published county history. Ledgers, deeds, letters, all manner of documents. They'd argue for days, their voices carrying across the snow. Something about their inheritance, about what was rightfully theirs. The father, Jacob, would sit at the head of the table, not speaking, just watching his sons debate. She said the look in his eyes wasn't pride like you might expect, but something closer to fear. This ritual apparently continued after Jacob's death, with Elijah taking his father's place at the head of the table. What exactly they discussed during these winter accountings remains unknown, but Martha's grandmother insisted that on the last night she worked at the Adair home, she overheard Elijah say something that disturbed her deeply. "The blood is what matters. The blood is the only proof." The Adair property consisted of the main house, a weathered barn that leaned slightly to the east, a smokehouse built from river stones and clay mortar, and a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house. The surrounding 50 acres included a small apple orchard with trees that produced small, tart fruit, pasture for their 2 milk cows and single horse, and fields that yielded modest crops of corn and tobacco when the weather cooperated. A spring-fed well provided water year-round, its stone housing constructed by Silas Adair himself in the 1820s. What few neighbors they had rarely visited. The path to the Adair place wound through a stand of ancient oaks that locals called Widow's Grove, named for the 3 Cutter's Gap women who had hanged themselves there during the especially harsh winter of 1842. Some claim they could still hear weeping among the trees when the wind blew just right. Children were forbidden from taking shortcuts through the grove, even in daylight. The Adairs, however, seemed unbothered by the grove's reputation, walking through it daily without hesitation. Thomas had a talent for carpentry, and the interior of the Adair home reflected this skill. Hand-carved moldings adorned doorways and windows. A sweeping banister of polished walnut graced the staircase that led to the second floor, and built-in cabinets with intricate lattice work set their home apart from the utilitarian dwellings typical of the region. Each piece showed meticulous attention to detail, with hidden touches visible only upon close inspection. A family of tiny carved squirrels nestled in the corner of a window frame, a series of interconnected letters, spelling out biblical verses along the edges of shelves. Elijah, in contrast, focused on practicalities, maintaining the root cellar's precise temperature through careful ventilation, smoking meat to perfection in the stone smokehouse, and keeping meticulous records of every penny that came in or went out of the household. His handwriting, preserved in ledgers recovered years later, was cramped but perfectly legible, each number formed with obsessive precision. Their routine rarely varied. Dawn to dusk was for work, with a brief midday meal eaten in silence. Evenings were spent in the main room, Elijah at the desk tallying figures by lamplight, Thomas in the rocking chair by the fire, reading from one of the few books they owned or writing in his journal. They spoke little during these hours, having exhausted necessary conversation during the day's labor. Occasionally Thomas would read aloud a passage that had caught his attention, or Elijah would announce the results of a particularly successful transaction. But mostly the nights passed in a comfortable silence, broken only by the scratch of pen on paper and the crack of burning logs. On Sundays, unlike most in Cutter's Gap, they did not attend church. Instead, they would walk the boundaries of their property together, inspecting fences and markers. The local preacher, Reverend Abernathy, had called on them twice to encourage attendance, but after being met with stony silence on his second visit, he never returned. From his pulpit, he occasionally mentioned those who dwell in darkness, his gaze drifting toward the mountain where the Adair home stood, but he never again spoke their name in public. The winter of 1870-1871 had been especially brutal. Snow came early, in late October, and showed no signs of relenting. Game was scarce, and even the hardiest families were feeling the pinch of hunger by January. Children went to bed with empty stomachs, and more than one infant failed to survive the combination of cold and malnutrition. The community pulled together as best they could, sharing what little they had, gathering for communal meals where a single deer might be stretched to feed 20 people. The Adairs, however, seemed unaffected. Their smokehouse was well stocked, their cellar full of preserves and root vegetables. This abundance in a time of communal hardship did not go unnoticed. When they came to town, they did not appear thinner or more haggard as their neighbors did. Their clothes remained clean and in good repair. They declined to participate in the communal meals, and though they occasionally traded surplus food to specific families, they never contributed to the general welfare of Cutter's Gap. They always had enough when others didn't, recalled Jackson Cooper, who was 10 years old in 1871. My pa said it wasn't natural, the way their stores never seemed to run low, even in the worst winters. Said they must have a secret cache somewhere, or maybe they were hoarding what should have been shared. There was talk among some of the men about paying the Adairs a visit, to encourage them to be more Christian in their ways, but no one ever did. Something about that place, about those brothers, people found reasons not to go up that mountain unless they had to. This resentment simmered beneath the surface of community interactions. When children went hungry in other homes, the knowledge that the reclusive Adair brothers had plenty became a festering wound in the collective consciousness of Cutter's Gap. Mothers would look up at the faint light, visible from the Adair house on clear nights, and mutter prayers that sounded suspiciously like curses. Fathers would grip their tools more tightly when the brothers passed, knuckles whitening with suppressed emotion. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that the brothers' preparation for winter extended beyond normal prudence into something approaching obsession. Later examination of the property would reveal hidden storage spaces beneath floorboards, behind false walls, and in the hollow core of a massive oak stump behind the barn. The brothers weren't just preparing for a hard winter, they were preparing for catastrophe. And in their minds, perhaps, they were right to do so, for what happened next would indeed be catastrophic, though not in any way they could have anticipated. The disaster that befell the Adair brothers came not from outside their walls, but from within, from secrets kept too long and truths revealed too suddenly. On the morning of January 19, 1871, something changed in the Adair household. We know this because Thomas wrote about it in his journal, the last entry he would ever make. The journal was recovered months later, hidden in the space between the chimney and the north wall of the house. Its water-damaged pages revealed only fragments of what must have been Thomas's final thoughts. Elijah woke before dawn, standing over my bed, said he heard it again, the scratching in the walls. I told him it was just mice seeking warmth, but he wouldn't listen. He's convinced someone is trying to get in, or perhaps more disturbingly, that something is trying to get out. His eyes were wild in the lamplight, pupils so large I could barely see the brown. He hasn't slept in 3 days now. I fear for his mind. The rest of the page was illegible, the ink blurred by moisture that had seeped through the chimney stones over the decades, but the next line, partially visible, read, "The cellar. He insists we move everything to the cellar today, all of it, says it's the only safe place now that they know." When I asked who they were, he laughed in a way I've never heard before. "Family," he said. "It's always family." Who they were, and what they supposedly knew, remains one of the central mysteries of the Adair case. What we do know is that on that day, something set in motion a chain of events that would end in one of the most disturbing scenes ever discovered in Appalachian history. It began with a sound that Elijah claimed to hear coming from within the walls of their home. "A scratching," he told Thomas, "like fingernails dragging slowly across the wooden beams that held up their lives." Thomas initially dismissed it as the natural settling of a house in winter's grip, or perhaps rodents seeking shelter from the cold. But Elijah was insistent, almost frantic. He described the sound as deliberate: 3 scratches, then silence, then 3 more. A pattern, a message. By midday, Elijah's paranoia had reached a breaking point. He began pulling up floorboards in the main room, claiming he could hear the scratching directly beneath their feet. Thomas, according to his fragmented journal entries, attempted to calm his brother, suggesting that perhaps he needed rest, that the isolation of winter was affecting his mind. He prepared a tea of valerian root, hoping to soothe Elijah's nerves and help him sleep. Elijah responded by striking Thomas across the face, the first act of violence between the brothers that we know of. The blow was documented in Thomas's journal. "His knuckles caught my cheekbone. I tasted blood. In his eyes I saw not my brother, but a stranger. He apologized immediately, helped me to a chair, brought a cold cloth for my face. But something had changed between us. A threshold crossed. What followed was a day of feverish activity. Neighbors would later report seeing smoke billowing from the Adair chimney all through the day and night, unusual even for the coldest days of winter. Samuel Tate, passing by again on the afternoon of the 19th, observed the brothers moving crates from the main house to the root cellar. He noted that Thomas appeared to be limping, and that Elijah kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the tree line as if expecting to see someone watching. The brothers were moving all their valuables, documents, and preserved food to the root cellar, which Elijah had apparently decided was the only safe place on the property. Thomas's journal fragment mentioned that Elijah had reinforced the cellar door with additional boards and installed a heavy iron lock he had purchased months earlier from the blacksmith, supposedly for a storage chest that was never built. As darkness fell on January 19th, Samuel Tate, returning from checking his traps, passed by the Adair property again. This time, he noticed something odd. All the windows of the house were covered from the inside with what appeared to be blankets or sheets. No light escaped from the home, but the barn door stood open, a lantern visible inside. Even stranger, he observed a figure he believed to be Elijah standing in the doorway of the barn, staring directly at him as he passed on the road below. Though it was too dark to see clearly, Tate would later swear that Elijah was smiling. Tate, concerned but unwilling to intrude, continued on his way home. He would later tell investigators that he considered checking on the brothers, but decided against it. "The Adairs kept to themselves," he said. "It wasn't my place to pry." His wife noted that when he arrived home that evening, he was uncharacteristically quiet and insisted on checking that all their doors and windows were securely locked before retiring for the night. This decision would haunt Tate for the rest of his life, for whatever was happening inside the Adair home that night would remain unknown until 5 days later, when the first body was discovered. And by then, it was far too late for anyone to intervene in the tragedy that had begun with a scratching in the walls. After the strange behavior observed by Samuel Tate, the Adair property fell silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. No movement was visible from the road. The heavy snow that fell on January 20th covered any tracks that might have led to or from the property, creating a pristine blanket of white that suggested undisturbed peace. For 3 days, no one in Cutter's Gap thought to check on the brothers. This wasn't unusual. The Adairs often went weeks without venturing into town or receiving visitors, especially during winter. And with the new snowfall making travel difficult, most families were focused on their own survival. The community had more pressing concerns than the welfare of 2 men who had always made it clear they preferred to be left alone. On January 23rd, however, 12-year-old William Harper made a discovery that would shatter the quiet of Cutter's Gap forever. William had been hunting rabbits with his father's slingshot, a forbidden activity that explained why he kept his discovery secret for nearly 24 hours. At the edge of the Adair property, just within the tree line that marked the boundary between the brothers' land and the public hunting grounds, William spotted what he initially thought was a fallen branch protruding from the snow. It wasn't until he was almost upon it that he realized what he was seeing. Human fingers, bluish-white with cold, curved upward like the claws of a dead bird. William would later say that he stood frozen for what felt like hours, unable to move or look away. When he finally summoned the courage to brush away some of the surrounding snow, he uncovered a human hand and part of a forearm, the flesh mottled with patches of frostbite. Terrified, William fled home, but said nothing until the following morning, when guilt and fear finally compelled him to confess to his father what he had seen. Robert Harper immediately gathered 3 other men from the community: James Wilson, the storekeeper, Frederick Jenkins, the blacksmith, and Clayton Moore, a former sheriff's deputy who had moved to Cutter's Gap after losing his leg in the Civil War. Together they trudged through the snow to the location William had described. There, partially buried by drifting snow, lay the body of Thomas Adair. He was dressed only in his nightshirt, despite the freezing temperatures. His bare feet were blue with cold, and his eyes stared sightlessly at the winter sky. Most disturbing was the expression frozen on his face, not one of fear or pain, but of profound confusion, as if death had come as a complete surprise. The men covered the body with a blanket one of them had brought, and sent young Jamie Wilson running back to town to fetch Sheriff Caldwell from the county seat. Then they made a decision that, in retrospect, might have destroyed crucial evidence. They decided to check the Adair house for Elijah or any clues to what had happened. The front door of the Adair home was unlocked, swinging open at the first push. Inside, the house was cold as a tomb, the fire long dead, ash scattered across the hearth as if someone had kicked it in haste. The main room was in disarray, floorboards torn up as Thomas had described in his journal, furniture overturned, papers scattered. But it was what they found on the dining table that caused Robert Harper to vomit into the cold fireplace. A neat row of 9 human teeth arranged in order of size, smallest to largest. Beside the teeth lay a pair of pliers crusted with what appeared to be dried blood, and written on the wall above the table, in what would later be confirmed as Thomas's handwriting, were the words, "He is not my brother." The men, thoroughly unnerved, conducted only a cursory search of the rest of the house. They found no sign of Elijah, though his coat and boots remained by the door. In the kitchen, a pot of stew had been left to spoil on the stove. 2 bowls sat on the counter beside it, both containing the same congealed remains of what would have been the brothers' last meal together. Upstairs they found Thomas's bedroom undisturbed, the bed neatly made. Elijah's room, however, showed signs of a struggle. The mattress had been partially pulled from the bed frame, a lamp lay shattered on the floor, and the window was open, snow having drifted onto the sill and floor beneath it. Most disturbing was a series of deep gouges in the wooden floor, as if someone had clawed desperately at the boards while being dragged from the room. When Sheriff Caldwell arrived 3 hours later, accompanied by his deputy and the county coroner, the scene was secured and a proper investigation began. The coroner's initial examination of Thomas's body revealed the cause of death to be exposure. He had simply frozen to death in the snow. But this raised more questions than it answered. Why would Thomas have left the house in his nightclothes during one of the coldest nights of winter? And why were all of his teeth intact when 9 human teeth lay on the dining table? The sheriff ordered a thorough search of the property. Thomas's body was wrapped in canvas and placed on a sled for transport to town. Meanwhile, the men spread out, examining every outbuilding and checking the perimeter of the property for any sign of Elijah or evidence of what had transpired. The search for Elijah Adair began in earnest, with the growing suspicion that whatever had happened in that house, he was either another victim or the perpetrator. As daylight faded, lanterns were lit, and the men expanded their search to the barn and outbuildings. It was Deputy Marshall who made the next discovery, one that would give the entire case its most inexplicable aspect. In the barn, hanging from a roof beam, was a crude effigy made of straw and cloth. It wore Elijah's Sunday shirt and trousers, and where the face should have been was a cloth sack stuffed with straw. Pinned to the chest was a piece of paper bearing the same message found in the house. "He is not my brother." As the men stood staring at this macabre display, a sound drew their attention to the back of the barn, a soft whimpering, almost like a wounded animal. Following the noise, they found a small door, previously unknown even to those familiar with the property, leading to what appeared to be a storage space beneath the barn's wooden floor. Sheriff Caldwell drew his revolver before pulling the door open. The lantern light revealed a dirt-floored space about 6 feet square, and there, curled in the corner, rocking back and forth and whimpering like a child, was Elijah Adair, or at least they assumed it was Elijah. The man was unrecognizable from the stern, composed figure known to the community. His clothes were torn and soiled with what appeared to be a mixture of blood, dirt, and human waste. His face was covered in scratches, as if he had clawed at his own skin. Most disturbing of all, his mouth was a bloody ruin. Every tooth had been pulled from his gums, apparently with the pliers found in the house. When Caldwell spoke his name, the broken man looked up, his eyes unfocused. "Not Elijah," he mumbled through bloody lips. "Never was, never was." He knew, Thomas knew. Those words would be the last he ever spoke. Despite being wrapped in blankets and taken immediately to Doc Simmons's house in town, the man they presumed to be Elijah Adair died of shock and blood loss before midnight. He never regained enough lucidity to explain what had happened or to confirm his identity. And this is where the official explanation, such as it was, began to take shape, a shape that many in Cutter's Gap found too convenient, too neat to account for the horror discovered on the Adair property. Years passed after the grim discoveries at the Adair homestead. The property remained abandoned, gradually reclaimed by the encroaching forest. The house still stood, but nature worked steadily to erase it. Vines crept up the walls, the roof began to sag, and animals made homes in its darkened rooms. In Cutter's Gap, people spoke of the tragedy in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all. Children were taught to avoid the path that led up the mountain to the old Adair place, though none were told exactly why. The official report filed by Sheriff Caldwell concluded that Elijah Adair had suffered a mental breakdown, assaulted his brother, and then mutilated himself in a fit of insanity. Thomas, injured but alive, had attempted to flee in the night and succumbed to the cold. This explanation was accepted by the county judge, who ordered the case closed after a cursory inquest at which no residents of Cutter's Gap were called to testify. This explanation satisfied the county authorities and was dutifully reported in the Cumberland Chronicle on February 3, 1871. The article was brief, clinical, and buried on page 6 beneath advertisements for patent medicines and announcements of upcoming livestock auctions. It mentioned only that 2 brothers had died as a result of tragic circumstances, with no details of the scene discovered at the property. The matter was considered closed. But in Cutter's Gap, the silence surrounding the Adair incident took on a weight of its own. Children were forbidden to mention the brothers or to venture near the abandoned property. When outsiders asked about the empty house, visible from certain points along the main road, they were given vague answers about a family that had moved on. The teeth found on the dining table were never mentioned in the official report, nor was the strange message written on the wall. The effigy in the barn was burned by Sheriff Caldwell himself before leaving the property. The silence was maintained so effectively that within a generation, many younger residents knew nothing of what had happened there. The Adair name became taboo, a word unspoken except in the privacy of the oldest homes, where grandparents might still cross themselves at its mention. The few who remembered the brothers firsthand took their memories to their graves, seemingly grateful to be free of the burden of knowing. Even those most directly involved in the discovery appeared eager to forget. William Harper, who found Thomas's body, left Cutter's Gap at 16 to work in the coal mines further south. He never returned, even for his parents' funerals. Samuel Tate, the last person to see the brothers alive, became increasingly reclusive, eventually moving his family to a cabin so remote that they had to travel 2 days to reach the nearest settlement. Sheriff Caldwell resigned his position 6 months after the incident and relocated to Tennessee, where he reportedly drank himself to death within 2 years. The house itself stood empty, a silent sentinel on the hillside. No one claimed the property, though tax records indicate that payments continued to be made through a lawyer in the county seat until 1892, when the land officially escheated to the county. Even then, no effort was made to sell it or put it to use. It was as if, by unspoken agreement, the entire community had decided to let the memory of the Adair brothers fade into oblivion. And perhaps that would have been the end of the story. A local tragedy gradually forgotten, if not for the arrival of Harriet Prentice in the spring of 1904. Harriet was a widow from Philadelphia, a woman of means and education who had purchased the old Wilson property with the intention of establishing a small school for the children of Cutter's Gap. Her arrival was met with cautious optimism by a community that had seen little change or progress in decades. At 52, Harriet was past the age when most women of her era embarked on new ventures, particularly in such remote locations. She had lost her husband and only son to typhoid 5 years earlier, and friends in Philadelphia worried that her decision to move to the isolated mountains of Kentucky represented a kind of giving up rather than a new beginning. But Harriet saw it differently. "There is work to be done here," she wrote to her sister. "Children who need education, stories that need preserving before they disappear entirely. I feel more purpose here than I have since Charles and little Edward were taken from me." She brought with her a substantial library, a piano that required 8 men to carry up the mountain road, and a burning curiosity about her new home and its history. Unlike many outsiders who came to Appalachia with preconceived notions about the backwardness of mountain people, Harriet approached her new neighbors with genuine respect and interest in their traditions, stories, and knowledge. It was this curiosity that led her inevitably to questions about the abandoned Adair property, visible from her bedroom window on clear days. At first, her inquiries were met with the same evasions offered to all outsiders. But Harriet was persistent, and as she gained the community's trust through her work with their children, the wall of silence began to crack. Martha Camden, whose grandmother had worked for the Adair family, was the first to speak openly with Harriet about the tragedy. Over tea in Harriet's parlor, she shared what little she knew, the rumors of the brothers' strange behavior, the discovery of the bodies, the inexplicable message, "He is not my brother." "My grandmother wouldn't speak of it directly," Martha told Harriet, "but late at night, when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her tell my grandfather things about how there was something not right with those boys, especially Elijah. How he would sometimes stare at her while she worked, not blinking, just watching. And once she found him standing over Thomas's bed while Thomas slept, just looking down at him, with this expression she couldn't describe, but that made her quit her position the very next day." Intrigued rather than repelled, Harriet began what would become a 3-year investigation into the Adair case. She visited the county courthouse, examining property records, birth certificates, and the original sheriff's report. She interviewed elderly residents who remembered the brothers or their parents. She even, despite strong discouragement from the community, visited the abandoned Adair homestead. "The house stands as if waiting," she wrote in her journal on June 12, 1904. "The door hanging open, rooms exposed to the elements, yet oddly preserved. It is as if time itself has avoided this place, unwilling to heal what was broken here. I spent only 20 minutes inside before the atmosphere became too oppressive to bear. Even in broad daylight I felt watched, though I was entirely alone. Most disturbing was the dining room table, still standing after all these years, with 9 circular stains arranged in a neat row across its surface." During her exploration of the house, Harriet made a discovery that had somehow been overlooked or ignored by Sheriff Caldwell and his men 33 years earlier. In the main bedroom, beneath a loose floorboard that had warped over the years, she found a small tin box containing documents that would cast the entire Adair case in a new and disturbing light. Among these papers was a letter dated October 3, 1848, addressed to Margaret Adair, the brothers' mother. The letter was from the Riverside Foundling Home in Pittsburgh and concerned the adoption of a male child, approximately 2 years of age, with remarkable blue eyes and a disposition both calm and observant. The letter referred to previous correspondence and indicated that arrangements had been made for the child to be delivered to the Adair home by a Mr. Whitaker, who would require the agreed-upon sum of $30 and the signed documents enclosed herewith. Also in the box was a locket containing a small portrait of a woman who was decidedly not Margaret Adair, and a lock of dark hair. On the back of the portrait was inscribed, "Mother of Elijah, remembered with sorrow." The portrait showed a young woman with sharp features and the same distinctive blue eyes that Elijah Adair had been known for. Her expression was solemn, her hair arranged in a style that had been fashionable in the 1830s. These discoveries suggested something that had never been officially acknowledged. Elijah Adair was adopted, not born to the family. He was not, in the biological sense, Thomas's brother at all. But this revelation, significant as it was, only deepened the mystery. If Thomas had discovered that Elijah was adopted, why would this knowledge lead to violence? The brothers had lived together for decades, their bond apparently strong enough to keep them together even after their parents' deaths. What could have changed? Harriet's investigation took a decisive turn when she managed to locate and interview Dr. Gerald Simmons, son of the physician who had treated the dying Elijah in 1871. The younger Simmons, now practicing medicine in Louisville, had assisted his father that night and remembered details that had never made it into the official report. The man they brought in was not Elijah Adair, Dr. Simmons told Harriet, during their meeting on September 20, 1906. "I knew Elijah. I had set his broken arm 2 summers prior when he fell from his horse. The man who died in my father's surgery had the same build, similar features, but he was not the same person. My father noticed it too, but Sheriff Caldwell was insistent that we were mistaken, that the physical differences were due to his injuries and emaciated state." When Harriet pressed him on what specific differences he had observed, Simmons hesitated before answering. "His eyes," he finally said. "Elijah Adair had brown eyes, like his brother. The man who died that night had blue eyes. And there was something else, a small birthmark behind his right ear, shaped like a crescent moon. Elijah had no such mark, at least not when I treated his arm." This testimony suggested a possibility so outlandish that Harriet initially dismissed it, that neither of the dead men was Elijah Adair, that the real Elijah had disappeared and been replaced by someone else before the tragedy occurred. But as she continued her investigation, more inconsistencies emerged. Several residents who had interacted with Elijah in the weeks before the incident reported subtle changes in his behavior. He seemed less certain of local geography, had trouble recognizing distant acquaintances, and spoke with a slightly different cadence than before. Most telling was the testimony of Abigail Tate, Samuel's wife, who recalled, "The last time I saw Elijah Adair in Wilson's store, he didn't recognize me, though I'd sold him eggs every spring for 15 years. And when Samuel spoke to him about the lightning that had struck the old oak by Cutter's Creek, Elijah looked blank, then nodded as if remembering something he'd been told rather than something he'd experienced. I thought it strange at the time, but didn't dwell on it." These recollections, combined with the documents found in the Adair home, led Harriet to a theory that she outlined in a letter to her sister in Philadelphia, dated November 30th, 1906. "I believe that the man known as Elijah Adair was indeed not Thomas's brother, not because he was adopted, but because at some point in the months before the tragedy he was replaced by an impostor. Who this impostor was and what became of the real Elijah remains unknown, but I am convinced that Thomas discovered the deception, confronted the false Elijah, and paid with his life. The impostor then, for reasons I cannot fathom, mutilated himself before succumbing to his injuries or to remorse. Harriet's theory, however, remained private. Before she could publish her findings or share them more widely, she fell ill with pneumonia in the winter of 1907. She died on February 12th, her investigation unfinished, her notes and collected evidence stored in a trunk in her bedroom. That trunk and its explosive contents might have remained undiscovered if not for a fire that swept through the former Wilson property in 1923. As workers cleared the debris, they found the trunk, its contents remarkably preserved within a metal lining. The documents were turned over to the County Historical Society, where they remained largely ignored until 1967. By then, Cutter's Gap had long since been abandoned, its residents scattered after the coal company bought up most of the land in 1932. The Adair property, along with the rest of the settlement, was demolished to make way for mining operations. Nothing remains today but a few stone foundations, barely visible beneath decades of forest growth. The truth about what happened to the Adair brothers, who was killed, who did the killing, and why, might never be fully known. But Harriet Prentice's investigation, incomplete as it was, offers a glimpse into a mystery that the authorities of 1871 were too quick to dismiss as a simple case of madness and murder. Richard Miller was obsessed with forgotten histories. As a professor of Appalachian studies at the University of Kentucky, he had built his career on uncovering the stories that time, or deliberate human effort, had buried. When he stumbled across Harriet Prentice's investigation in the archives of the Cumberland County Historical Society in 1967, he knew he had found something extraordinary. The Adair case had everything that fascinated him: mysterious deaths, a remote setting, and a conspiracy of silence that had successfully erased the event from public memory. Miller spent the next 3 years tracing every lead, interviewing descendants of Cutter's Gap residents, and searching for any physical evidence that might remain. His research led him back to the site of the Adair homestead, now just a clearing in the forest on land owned by Eastern Kentucky Coal. With permission from the company and accompanied by 2 graduate students, Miller conducted an archaeological survey of the area in the summer of 1970. The foundation stones are still visible, he wrote in his field notes, arranged in the rectangular pattern that matches the dimensions recorded in the county property assessment of 1865. Of the barn, only the stone footings remain, along with a depression in the earth that likely marks the location of the hidden space where the supposed Elijah was found. But it was what they discovered behind the house that would add the final chilling piece to the Adair puzzle. Approximately 50 yards from where the back door would have stood, partially concealed by a fallen oak and decades of undergrowth, they found a small family cemetery. 3 gravestones stood in a row, weathered but still legible. Jacob Adair, 1803-1861, Margaret Adair, 1810-1863, and a third stone that read simply, Elijah Adair, beloved son, 1839-1870. The date on this third stone was a revelation. If accurate, it meant that the real Elijah Adair had died in 1870, months before the tragedy that claimed the lives of Thomas and the unknown impostor. This aligned perfectly with Harriet Prentice's theory, though she had never found proof of Elijah's death. Further excavation revealed a 4th grave, unmarked and slightly apart from the others. When opened under the supervision of the county coroner, it was found to contain the remains of a man estimated to have been in his early 30s at the time of death. The skeleton showed no obvious signs of trauma, but it was impossible to determine the cause of death after so many years. Most significant was what was found with the body, a journal similar to the one Thomas had kept, but older and more weathered. Though many pages were illegible, enough could be read to piece together a disturbing narrative. The journal appeared to belong to Elijah Adair, with entries dating from 1866 to late 1870. The early entries described mundane farm activities, business transactions, and occasional reflections on life with Thomas. But beginning in March 1870, the tone changed dramatically. Thomas brought a man home today, read an entry dated March 17, 1870. Says he found him injured on our south ridge, leg caught in one of the old bear traps. Strange that anyone would be up there, miles from the main road. Stranger still that Thomas insists he stay with us until healed. There's something familiar about him that unsettles me. When he looks at me, it's as if he's memorizing my face. Subsequent entries documented the stranger's recovery and an increasingly tense atmosphere in the house. The man who gave his name as John Smith, an obvious pseudonym that raised Elijah's suspicions, remained at the Adair home long after his leg had healed enough for travel. Thomas seemed uncharacteristically attached to the stranger, spending hours in private conversation with him while Elijah worked the farm alone. By May, Elijah was recording arguments with Thomas about their guest, who apparently refused to leave or explain his presence in the remote area. Asked Thomas again about Smith's origins, Elijah wrote on May 10th. He became defensive, said I was being inhospitable. But I've seen how Smith watches me when Thomas isn't looking, how he practices my signature on scraps of paper he thinks I don't find. Something is very wrong here. A June entry was particularly disturbing. Found Smith in my room today, wearing my Sunday coat, standing before my mirror. When he saw me in the reflection, he didn't even startle, just smiled and said he was practicing. Thomas came in and acted as if nothing was amiss. Later overheard them arguing in the barn. Thomas shouted, "Not yet! What are they waiting for?" The entries became increasingly paranoid through the summer and fall, with Elijah reporting that items in the house had been moved, that his clothes seemed to have been worn by someone else, that Thomas and Smith would fall silent whenever he entered a room. He began sleeping with a knife under his pillow and taking his meals separately, preparing his own food rather than eating what Thomas cooked. The final legible entry, dated November 2nd, 1870, was the most disturbing. He watches me. Not Thomas. He watches. When I turn suddenly, I catch him studying my movements, my speech, the way I hold my fork at supper. Last night I woke to find him standing in my doorway, just staring. When I asked what he wanted, he smiled and said, "Just learning." Thomas sees nothing wrong. Says I'm being unkind to our guest. But I know now why he seems familiar. The resemblance is subtle but unmistakable. He has our father's eyes. The journal ended there, with no explanation of what happened next. But combined with the grave dated 1870, a new theory emerged. The stranger had somehow killed Elijah and taken his place, with Thomas either complicit in the deception or unaware of the switch. Then, months later, Thomas discovered the truth, leading to the violent confrontation that ended both their lives. But who was the impostor? And what possible motive could he have had for inserting himself into the isolated life of the Adair brothers? Miller's research provided a possible answer, though it could never be proven conclusively. In county birth records, he found that Jacob and Margaret Adair had registered the birth of twin boys on April 10, 1839, Elijah and Ezekiel. But subsequent census records mentioned only Elijah and later Thomas, born in 1844. Ezekiel had disappeared from the official record. Further investigation revealed a notation in the church records of Reverend Joseph Abernathy, dated June 1839, consulted by J. Adair regarding the younger twin. Condition worsening. Advised surrender to God's will. This suggested that Ezekiel, the unrecorded twin, had suffered from some condition or deformity that led to his being hidden away or possibly given up for adoption. If so, might the mysterious stranger have been this long-lost twin returning to claim what he saw as his birthright? It would explain the resemblance that Elijah noted, the impostor's ability to eventually fool the community, though not those who knew Elijah best, and perhaps even the message left at the scene, "He is not my brother." For if the impostor was indeed Ezekiel Adair, then his statement was technically true. He was not Elijah's brother, he was his twin. And Thomas, born 5 years later, would have been his half-brother at most if the rumors about Margaret Adair's relationship with a traveling salesman named Thomas Reynolds had any truth to them. Another discovery supported this theory. In the records of the Riverside Foundling home, Miller found documentation of a child named Ezekiel, received in 1839 and adopted in 1842 by a family named Whitaker, the same name mentioned in the letter to Margaret Adair, but in reference to bringing a child to the Adairs, not taking one away. Could the Whitakers have been paid to return their adopted son to his birth family years later? And if so, why? The final piece of evidence came from a surprising source. In 1971, Miller received a letter from Eleanor Whitaker, an elderly woman living in Cincinnati. She had read about his research in a small newspaper article and claimed to be the granddaughter of James and Sarah Whitaker, the couple who had adopted Ezekiel Adair. According to family stories passed down to her, her grandparents had adopted a boy from a foundling home, only to return him to his birth family years later after a substantial payment. Her grandmother had always expressed regret about this decision, saying they had sold the boy back like he was property. Most tellingly, Eleanor remembered her grandmother describing the boy as having unusual eyes, one blue and one brown, a condition known as heterochromia. If true, this would explain the confusion about Elijah's eye color. The real Elijah had brown eyes, like Thomas. The impostor, Ezekiel, had one blue eye and one brown. Depending on the angle from which he was viewed, different observers might report different eye colors. Miller published his findings in a 1972 monograph titled Erasure and Remembrance, The Adair Tragedy of 1871. The work received modest attention in academic circles, but little public notice. The story of the Adair brothers remained, as it had been for a century, largely forgotten. Until now. I've shared this story not to sensationalize a tragedy, but to resurrect a piece of Appalachian history that deserves to be remembered. The Adair case speaks to themes that resonate across time: the secrets families keep, the fragility of identity, and the lengths to which communities will go to protect themselves from uncomfortable truths. The impostor who died in the Adair home, whether the long-lost Ezekiel or someone else entirely, took most of his secrets to the grave. We may never know his true identity or motive, but in the silence that followed, in the collective effort to forget what happened at Cutter's Gap, we can recognize a pattern that has repeated throughout history, in Appalachia and beyond. When faced with horrors that defy easy explanation, humans often choose forgetting over understanding. We bury not just the dead, but the very knowledge of their existence. We rewrite narratives to make them simpler, more palatable. We choose comfortable lies over difficult truths. The site of the Adair homestead is now part of Cumberland Ridge State Forest. No plaque marks the location. No trail leads visitors to the overgrown cemetery where 4 bodies lie in varying states of decay. If you were to walk through those woods today, you would find nothing to suggest the tragedy that unfolded there 154 years ago. But the next time you drive through the winding roads of eastern Kentucky, past abandoned mining towns and isolated homesteads, remember that the hills hold stories that have never been fully told. Remember that beneath the picturesque beauty of the Appalachian landscape lie secrets, some buried by time, others by choice. And perhaps if you listen carefully on a winter night, when the wind moves through the bare branches of ancient oaks, you might hear an echo of Thomas Adair's final realization that sometimes those closest to us are not who they claim to be. That identity is fragile, easily fractured or falsified. That the face in the mirror might not be your own, but a careful construction designed to deceive. For in the end, that is the most terrifying aspect of the Adair tragedy, not the violence or the mystery, but the implication that someone could study you so carefully, so completely, that they could step into your life and take your place, that they could wear your clothes, use your name, sleep in your bed, and no Not even those who claimed to love you would notice the difference until it was far too late.